The first time I noticed something was off with my mailbox was a Tuesday morning trash pickup day. I walked out to grab the newspaper, and there it was. My entire mailbox was tilted forward like it had been kicked, the lock was broken clean off, and the door was hanging wide open. I stood there, just staring at it for a second, trying to process. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to conclusions, but this wasn't random vandalism. No other mailboxes on the street were touched. Just mine. I'm Franklin Kessler. I'm a contractor, been living in this neighborhood for about 7 years. Kept to myself mostly, paid my dues, mowed my lawn, but the HOA, they never liked me. Especially Deborah Vaughn, president of the board and self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. Deborah was everything you'd expect. Short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, always holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. She once fined me $50 because my work truck was parked 6 inches over the sidewalk. I measured. It was 5.5. I called the post office that morning to report the mailbox damage, and the woman on the line said something that froze me. "Sir, you submitted a request to have your box unlocked due to a change of address, right?" "What? No. I live here." "Well, we received a signed request for mail forwarding and a key override. It was processed yesterday. So someone forged a request to reroute my mail. That's a federal offense." I knew exactly who it was before I even hung up. The HOA had been on my back for months about non-compliant exterior paint tones. My house is light gray. Apparently that clashed with their approved palette. I drove straight to the HOA office. Deborah's car was parked out front, her vanity plate reading Rules 1. I walked in, and there she was at the front desk, tapping away at a pink tablet. "Good morning, Mr. Kessler," she said without looking up. "Hear about the mailbox. You messed with federal property, Deborah," I said, stepping closer. "And you rerouted my mail. That's a felony." She finally looked up. "Excuse me, that's a wild accusation. Perhaps if your mailbox wasn't an eyesore to begin with, it was compliant." "You've got no authority to change anything about my personal mail, and I know you submitted that forwarding request." Her face twitched. "Prove it." So I did. I filed a report with the USP's inspection service that afternoon. I also requested a copy of the forged mail forwarding form. When it arrived 2 days later, I nearly laughed Deborah had actually signed it D. Vaughn, on behalf of HOA compliance. She didn't even bother to fake my name. I handed it straight to the postal inspector when he showed up at my house the following Monday. His name was Inspector Morales, and he didn't waste time. "This is clear mail fraud," he said, flipping through the paperwork. "We'll open an investigation immediately." I nodded. "Good, because I want her off that board. For good." When Inspector Morales left, I didn't waste any time. I knew the HOA would try to circle the wagons fast. They always did when one of their own got caught with a hand in the cookie jar. Sure enough, that evening, I noticed a black SUV parked just across from my driveway, engine running, lights off. Inside sat Randall Avery, the HOA's treasurer, pretending to scroll through his phone. He didn't even glance up when I walked out to check my security cam angles. Didn't need to. I'd already seen him on the footage from the night the mailbox was tampered with. I'd installed cameras years ago after a string of anonymous citations kept showing up on my doorstep. By now, every inch of my property from curb to back fence was covered. And the mailbox, that had a clear line of sight from the camera mounted under the eaves. The footage showed Randall pacing by it for almost 4 minutes, looking over his shoulder twice. Then he bent forward, did something out of view, and walked away fast. His license plate was clean in the shot. The next morning, I walked into the city clerk's office and requested the HOA's bylaws and meeting records. Public documents, as long as you know what to ask for. The clerk, a wiry woman named Sharon with a sharp eye, handed me a flash drive. "You're the third person this month asking for these," she said, flipping through her clipboard. I raised an eyebrow. "Really? Anyone else mention why?" She hesitated, then leaned in. "Neighbor down on Ivy Ridge said something about misused maintenance funds." Another guy claimed they'd altered the voting rules mid-meeting. I tucked the flash drive into my jacket. Sounds like I'm not the only one they've crossed. Back at home, I dug into the files. It didn't take long before the patterns started jumping out. There were discrepancies in budget reports, missing signatures on meeting approvals, and most damning, a set of scan notes labeled Compliance Strategy that detailed a plan to push out non-preferred homeowners by leveraging fines, permit denials, and in one case, mail diversion if necessary to interrupt paper trail. I printed every page and labeled them by category. Financial misconduct, voting irregularities, targeted harassment, mail tampering. Then I called a friend from college, Mina Cho, now a district attorney's investigator. We hadn't spoken in years, but she picked up within 2 rings. Mina, I've got something big. Federal mail fraud, HOA corruption, probably embezzlement. She didn't hesitate. Where do I meet you? We sat at a diner on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. I laid everything out on the table: USB drive, printed records, a copy of the mail forwarding form with Deborah's signature, and the security footage stills. Mina flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. This isn't just petty HOA drama, she said. This is systemic abuse of authority. If they rerouted your mail, they could have accessed sensitive personal info, bank statements, tax forms. That's a serious breach. I leaned back. Think it's enough for charges? More than enough. I'll loop in a postal inspector on our end and get a case file started, but you need to be ready. People like this don't go down quietly. She wasn't wrong. That night my power went out for 3 hours, just my house. Neighbors had lights on all down the block. I checked the breaker, flipped clean. Someone had tampered with the external box. I reported it, but there were no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just a message. 2 days later, I got a notice from the HOA claiming I was in violation for unauthorized surveillance equipment on my own property. They gave me 72 hours to remove all recording devices not pre-approved by the board. I laughed out loud reading it. Then I emailed the notice to Mina. She forwarded it to the postal inspector's office, and within 24 hours, I got a call from a federal agent named Langford. He was clipped, professional, and clearly not amused. We're expanding the scope of the investigation, he said. This goes beyond mail fraud. We're coordinating with local law enforcement to review complaints against the HOA stretching back 5 years. By the weekend, subpoenas were issued. I wasn't the only one who'd kept records. Turns out the woman on Ivy Ridge, she was an accountant, and she had spreadsheets showing that over $30,000 in annual dues couldn't be accounted for. The guy who mentioned voting irregularities, former Navy paralegal. He had audio from a closed-door meeting where Deborah and Randall discussed fast-tracking a property lien against a disabled retiree for non-compliant landscaping that turned out to be a vegetable garden. The dam was breaking. Word got around fast. Neighbors started knocking on my door, quietly at first, then more boldly. One by one, they shared their stories: fines for imaginary offenses, denied permits, mysteriously missing ballots during board elections. I organized a meeting in my garage. 23 households showed up. I rolled open the door, set out folding chairs, and projected the evidence onto a bedsheet nailed to the wall. This is what they've been doing, I said. Not just to me, to all of us. Gasps, murmurs, a few angry shouts, but most people just sat quietly nodding. They'd suspected. Now they knew. We formed a temporary residence committee and filed a formal petition to suspend the HOA board pending investigation. Under the bylaws, if over 50% of homeowners signed, the board could be placed under external review. We collected the signatures in 48 hours. The next Monday, Deborah and her cronies showed up to an emergency meeting called by the city's Legal Oversight Committee. They expected to control the room, but Agent Langford was already there, waiting with a folder in his hand. He stood when Deborah tried to speak first. "Before this meeting proceeds," he said, I have federal warrants for the seizure of HOA communication records, financial logs, and surveillance requests processed without homeowner consent. Deborah froze. Randall went pale. The third board member, some guy named Evan who mostly kept quiet, actually tried to slip out the back door before Langford called him back. I suggest you all sit. This won't take long. They sat. Langford laid out the charges: federal mail tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial misconduct, unlawful surveillance intimidation, and obstruction during a federal investigation. By the end of the meeting, the board was suspended indefinitely. But it didn't end there. By the time the board was officially dissolved, the neighborhood had shifted. People who used to nod politely and rush back indoors were now stopping in the street to talk, compare notes, shake hands. A quiet unity had formed, forged in the shared experience of finally seeing the bullies at the top brought down and knowing it wasn't over yet. Mina called me the following Thursday, her tone sharper than usual. We're digging deeper into the HOA's financials. Something's not adding up with their vendor contracts. I leaned against my truck, watching my neighbor across the street repaint his porch railing with his grandkids. How bad? She rifled through papers on her end. They created fake maintenance companies, paid themselves through them. We've traced over $85,000 in HOA dues funneled into two shell businesses, both registered under Randall's brother's name. That's state-level fraud on top of the federal charges. I let out a slow breath. You need anything from me? Actually, yeah. The committee you helped organize, can you get statements from residents who were pressured to approve unexpected budget increases or emergency fund reallocations? Anything that seemed fishy at the time. They'll talk. Give me the weekend. Saturday morning, I set up a table beneath a pop-up canopy in front of the old community park, the one that hadn't been maintained in 2 years, despite the HOA collecting a monthly amenity upkeep fee. Word had already gotten around, so by noon I had a line. One by one, residents gave their statements. A widow who was told she'd be fined unless she paid an emergency sidewalk resurfacing fee. A young couple who were tricked into signing a ballot they thought was for a new playground, but turned out to be a waiver for budget oversight. By Sunday evening, I had over 30 detailed records. Mina sent a courier to collect them. That same night, a squad car showed up in front of Randall's house. He didn't come out on his own. 2 officers escorted him, hands cuffed, head down. Deborah wasn't far behind. She was arrested the next morning at a coffee shop downtown. Both were booked on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and financial abuse of fiduciary responsibility. The local news finally picked up the story, and the headline ran bold across the screen: HOA leaders arrested in widening corruption scandal. The city responded fast. A temporary receiver was appointed to oversee all HOA operations. The receiver, Marlene Torres, was a retired judge with no patience for nonsense. She called a town hall in the elementary school gym the following week and showed up with a full audit team. She stood at the front of the room, flanked by 3 forensic accountants and a city attorney, and didn't sugarcoat a thing. Your HOA board committed multiple criminal acts, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. We've discovered unauthorized levies, falsified vendor contracts, and the attempted seizure of personal property under fraudulent pretenses. This wasn't mismanagement. This was an organized effort to exploit this community. Hands shot up. People shouted questions. Marlene held firm, answering each one in turn, never once losing her composure. When it was my turn, I asked the one thing no one else had yet. What happens to the people who were fined or forced to pay under false pretenses? Marlene nodded. We're working with the DA's office to begin restitution proceedings. All illegitimate fines will be refunded, and any liens placed under fraudulent authority are being reversed. Relief swept through the room like a tide, but there was one more piece that hadn't dropped yet. The mail tampering case. Inspector Morales reached out a week later. He wanted a final meeting to close the loop on the investigation. We met at the federal building downtown in a windowless room that smelled faintly of copier toner and old coffee. "The evidence you provided was critical," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "The forwarding request, the surveillance footage, and the internal HOA documents together, they gave us everything we needed." I flipped through the folder. Inside were copies of the charges filed against Deborah and Randall, along with a sealed indictment for another board member I hadn't expected, Evan. "He barely did anything," I said, confused. "He just sat there most of the time." Morales tapped the folder. "He was the one who submitted the original vendor invoices. Turns out he's the one who set up the fake P.O. boxes to funnel the checks. Randall and Deborah orchestrated it, but Evan laundered the paper trail. That makes him just as liable." I leaned back, processing that. "So what now? They'll face both federal and state charges. Mail fraud alone carries up to 5 years per count, and with the financial crimes stacked on top, they're looking at serious time." He paused, then added, "You did the right thing pressing charges when you did. Most people don't. They get intimidated, back off. But you didn't. That made the difference." I left the building with a strange sense of finality, not satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge, but something more grounded: justice, accountability. The feeling of standing your ground and watching the system, for once, work the way it's supposed to. Back in the neighborhood, the transformation was visible. The park finally got new benches, this time installed by volunteers. The community bulletin board was updated with real information, no more passive-aggressive notices or arbitrary warnings. People waved as they passed each other. The air felt less heavy, less watched. We held an election for a new board a month later. This time it was open, transparent, and overseen by a third-party mediator. I didn't run. I'd had enough politics to last a lifetime, but I supported a few good folks who'd been at those garage meetings, the ones who showed up when it counted. After the votes were tallied, an elderly woman named Mrs. Elkins, who'd lived in the neighborhood since the early 80s, was elected president. Her first act: she dissolved half the regulations Deborah had weaponized and created a rule requiring all HOA decisions to be published publicly within 24 hours. The best part: no more fines for mailbox designs, paint colors, or invisible landscaping violations. People planted what they wanted, painted how they liked. The community didn't fall apart, it flourished. One morning, I was repairing a fence panel when a man in a crisp button-down walked up. He introduced himself as Alan from the state attorney's office. Apparently, they were preparing a case study on HOA accountability and wanted to profile our neighborhood as an example of what could happen when residents took control. He asked if I had any advice for other homeowners in similar situations. I set down my hammer and thought for a second. Document everything. Don't let intimidation stop you, and when they try to push you around with fake rules and scare tactics, push back harder. The law's on your side if you're willing to dig. He nodded and jotted it down. Weeks passed. The trials were scheduled. Deborah's lawyer tried to argue diminished responsibility, claiming the pressure of managing an entire community had led to poor judgment. The judge didn't buy it. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with an additional 18 months suspended pending restitution. Randall got 5 years, no parole. Evan cut a plea deal and testified against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence of 16 months, the money they stole. Slowly it came back. Not all of its sum was gone forever, but enough to repair the damage. Enough to prove that justice wasn't just a word. And the mailbox? I rebuilt it sturdier than ever. Steel casing, tamper-proof lock, reinforced post. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a reminder of what happens when people stand together, of how the smallest violation, a broken lock, a rerouted letter, can unravel something much bigger when someone decides to fight back. And of how, sometimes, the most powerful tool in the world is a clipboard full of evidence and a neighborhood that finally says enough. The courthouse was packed the day of sentencing. Not with media or reporters, though a few local outlets had shown interest, but with residents. Neighbors who had once kept curtains drawn and eyes down now sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, arms crossed, expressions unreadable. No one clapped, no one jeered. Everyone just watched. I sat near the aisle, fourth row, next to the retired postal worker from the next block who'd quietly handed over an envelope of internal HOA mail she'd been mistakenly given months ago. She hadn't known what to do with it back then. Now, it was part of a sealed exhibit. The judge was meticulous. He read each charge aloud, giving weight to every word. Deborah kept her eyes forward. Randall blinked often, his jaw twitching every time the judge mentioned the financial breakdowns. Evan, seated a row behind them, didn't raise his head once. He'd already pled out. His cooperation shaved his sentence down, but it hadn't earned him sympathy. Not here. When it was over and the bailiffs led them out through the side door, a hush settled. No cheers. Just the kind of silence that comes when something long overdue finally happens. Outside, the afternoon air felt sharper than usual. As I stepped down the courthouse steps, Mina fell in beside me. She looked tired but satisfied. "They're going to dig a little deeper into the financial trail," she said. "There's a possibility Randall's brother rerouted part of the funds out of state. If that's true, we're not done." I nodded. "Let me know how I can help." "You already did," she said, then paused. "You thinking about moving after all this?" "Not anymore." Back in the neighborhood, the transition from oversight to self-governance was smoother than expected. Marlene remained for another 2 months to ensure compliance and close out the audits. During her last week, she held an open Q&A in the community center, where residents were invited to ask anything, no time limits. No pre-submitted questions. A man in the back, wearing a maintenance uniform with paint-stained boots, raised his hand. "Are we going to get a say in how future board members are selected?" Marlene didn't hesitate. "You already do. But we're adding a safeguard. An independent election monitor will oversee the next 2 cycles. After that, if the community votes to remove them, it can." A woman near the front leaned forward. "What happens if someone tries to pull this kind of thing again? Then the oversight process we've built will catch it before it festers," Marlene said. "But more importantly, you now know how to stop it. That's the difference." That was the last time she sat at the head of the room. She left the folder of finalized bylaws on the table, turned and walked out without ceremony. The new board, elected by a full majority, included a schoolteacher, a retired fire marshal, and the woman who ran the corner bakery. None of them had ever hoped to be on a board, but each had stepped up after the collapse, not because they wanted power, because they wanted peace. One afternoon, I was replacing the cracked stepping stones leading from my driveway to the porch when a boy from 2 doors down biked past, stopped, and circled back. "You're the guy who caught the bad people, right?" I looked up. "I'm the guy who got tired of being quiet." He grinned, then pedaled off again. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail, not forwarded, not redirected, not tampered with. It was from the state attorney's office, officially closing the investigation. Deborah and Randall's properties had been seized to repay restitution. Evan's plea deal required him to forfeit all profits from the shell companies and testify in future fraud cases. Attached to the letter was an official commendation. Not flashy, just a printed statement of appreciation for civic persistence in the face of organized community-level corruption. I didn't put it on the wall. I filed it away in a small, locked drawer where I kept important things. Not because I needed recognition, but because it reminded me of something simple. It was possible to win. Later that year, I was approached by a council member running for re-election. He asked if I'd consider joining the city's advisory board on local government transparency. I told him I wasn't a politician. He said that was exactly why he asked. I agreed on one condition. I'm not going to sit in a room and nod along. If I see someone pulling stunts like our old HOA board, I'll drag it into the light. That's what we want. The first meeting was strange. The room had polished floors, tall windows, and an old brass clock that ticked too loudly. But as I sat at the table, listening to proposals and policy revisions, I realized something. This wasn't enemy territory anymore. It was just another place where silence had once been the problem. One proposal caught my attention: a motion to require all homeowners associations in the county to register their financials quarterly with the city, including vendor contracts and penalty assessments. It passed unanimously. Back home, the neighborhood was quieter. Not in the way it had been when people were afraid, but in the way a place gets when folks can finally exhale. A new family moved in down the street. They painted their front door seafoam green, not on the old approved list. No one said a word. A few months later, another neighbor added solar panels to their garage roof. Nobody filed a complaint. At the next community potluck, I showed up with a tray of ribs and a cooler of lemonade. Someone handed me a paper plate. Someone else asked if I'd help with the grill next time. That night, as the sun dipped behind the houses and kids ran barefoot through the grass, I realized something simple. We hadn't just gotten rid of a corrupt board. We'd rebuilt the foundation they'd been rotting from beneath. Not with more rules or louder voices, but with vigilance, transparency, and the decision to stop waiting for someone else to fix things. A few people still call me the guy who broke the HOA. I don't correct them. Let the legend grow. If it keeps future board members honest, it's worth it. But between the paperwork, the late-night strategy sessions, and the court hearings, the truth was simpler. They tampered with the wrong mailbox.